Well, good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all those that are joining us today from around the globe. I'm Antonio Pantaloni, the amfori Network representative for Australia and New Zealand. Today's webinar, entitled The COVID-19 Crisis, the Impact on Supply Chain Sustainability, is brought to you in collaboration with the Netherlands Chamber of Commerce in Australia. amfori in the Netherlands represents the second largest membership group with 392 members. I'd like to acknowledge Norma, the network representative for the Netherlands, for her support in promoting today's event. And of course, a thank you to Naomi, Joyce, Anson, Eric, and all the amfori team who have helped with today's endeavour. Next slide, please. I would like to thank Jasper, who you can see in the right-hand corner, from the Netherlands Chamber for his great work in helping to make today happen. I would like to welcome members from both of our organisations and our invited guests. I am sure we have all been listening to a lot of webinars recently, and probably a lot of webinars about COVID-19. So thank you for listening to another one today. Today's focus is on supply chain sustainability. In this time of COVID-19, sustainability has taken somewhat of a backseat in our minds. However, it is something that we have all been working towards for many years, and it's something that we're going to have to address when the dust settles. Our global supply chains have been impacted at World War II levels. Our businesses have faced unprecedented challenges. Governments are struggling to grasp both the short and long-term effects of this global pandemic. In short, history is being made before our eyes. Today, we examine what this means in terms of sustainability, what the future holds, and how we build more resilient supply chains. In the interest of maximising our speakers' time, let's get straight into it. Let's begin with the housekeeping. You are all muted. During the question and answers, we will invite you to raise your hand to ask a question. We will unmute you so you can ask your question. We like this to be interactive. I encourage everyone to type their questions into the question box at any time during the presentation. Even if you raise your hand, we are still asking you to type your question in. Any unanswered questions today will be addressed in writing, and this will be sent out to everyone. This webinar is also being recorded, and you will receive a link to download it along with the questions and answers. Next slide, please. Today's agenda is very simple. Following my brief introduction, Henry from KPMG will be presenting on how to future-proof the supply chain. Following this, Christian of amfori will be discussing the tools used to measure sustainability and some of the data that we garner from this. Both of their profiles are available on our website, so in the interest of time, I will not be introducing them at length. They both have extensive experience and are world-class experts. Following their presentation, we will open the floor to questions. Again, please type in your questions when they come to mind. We will address all if they are typed, even if time doesn't permit us to answer them today during this webinar. Following our Q&A session, I will invite Jasper from the Netherlands Chamber of Commerce to close out today's webinar. So now I invite Henry to give his presentation. Henry from KPMG, whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Antonio. And I don't know where you got that picture from, but I love to look like that. So thanks for that.
All right, everyone, you can turn your webcams off now if you prefer.
Thank you. Good morning, Europe, and good afternoon, Asia and Australia. And once again, thanks for having me. I would like to take a few minutes to talk about the key lessons learned from COVID-19 and the actions leading organizations have taken to future-proof their supply chain. I will finish with briefly outlining the 6 capabilities KPMG has highlighted as part of our Future of Supply Chain series, which is discussing the capabilities required to lead and manage supply chains now and in the immediate future. However, before I get started, I'll briefly introduce myself. My name is Henry Brunekreef. I work at KPMG in Australia and I lead the national supply chain practice. Coming from the Netherlands, I can't say Holland anymore. Originally, it was of course quite easy to end up in a supply chain or logistics role. I did my master's at Cranfield University, and after a start at 3PL Logistics with Excel Logistics, I worked at Cisco and Rockwell Automation in European supply chain roles before moving to Australia. And in Australia, I've mainly been consulting for boutique supply chain firms, and for nearly the past 5 years, I've been at KPMG. It's my pleasure to be with you today, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and overall feedback. Next slide, please. Next one, please. I think this is the good thing about a consulting firm that's trying to get new font and format, and it's not always recognized by others across the board. But hey, here we go. I am very hopeful that all of you have taken your immediate crisis management actions successfully. But why do I still want to spend some time on the immediate actions? Because I think it's important, first of all, to validate that you've taken the right actions, but more importantly, be prepared in case there will be a second wave. And also, I think it's just better practice in any risk mitigation process, whether it's the impact of a hurricane, long-term labor strikes, or fighting the current crisis. So I think one of the first actions that good organizations, leading organizations did, was to establish a team to focus on supply chain assessment and risk management. This team will work to reconfigure global, regional, and local supply chain flows where possible, utilizing alternative modes of transportation, but also conducting trade-offs according to criticality, needs, cost, service, and risk scenario analysis of the viable options. It's also to create inventory and supply visibility across the end-to-end organization, rather than just at site level, to also understand the item availability at the consolidated level. And I'd like to give an example from Australia, where the health system, so the state-based health systems, were really caught out and really needed a lot of help to actually get a picture of what is my demand, where's my supply, what is my inventory position, and where's that inventory? Is that at a DC? Is that at the hospital? Is that at the ward level? Where is it actually based? And it was actually quite frightening to see that some of these health systems were being caught out, not having that visibility. It's also good, of course, to understand the actual demand. And when I say actual demand, it's the actual requirements versus the panic demand, in order to avoid supply delays due to bullwhip effect. And I think we've seen that a lot, where some of the organizations have seen a lot of panic buy, and therefore a lot of households actually holding onto inventory, and therefore there will be a delayed and a lag of actual demand. But also organizations that have not been able to fulfill demand, and where demand was actually lagging. So for example, in life sciences, that demand is where, for example, elective surgeries were being delayed and postponed. That demand is slowly coming back on track. So how do you actually manage that demand moving forward? Secondly, around mapping your supply chain, again, it's about building better visibility, but that really upstream into your suppliers. And I think a lot of organizations have good visibility in the tier 1 supply chain, but when you go into tier 2 and tier 3, that's where we saw that there was a lot of choke points in the supply chain. So having visibility to that level is absolutely fundamental. Thirdly, talking about what if scenarios. Again, in the current risk climate, businesses need to know and have the capability to do what if scenarios, because large uncertainty surrounds supply, demand, and the availability even of transportation options. So one thing is for certain, and that's that variability will be part of our future supply chains. I'll talk a little bit more about predictive supply chain risk management and the capability later on. But again, that is finding, and I go back into the health system. First and foremost, it was about the visibility of demand, supply, and inventory. But then furthermore, it was actually helping to say, on a predictive level, where might there be outbursts, where might there be outliers of the coronavirus, and if that is in a certain postcode, what impact is that going to have on local hospitals, what impact is that going to have on supplies of PPE, etc. And I think last but not least, I think it's the engagement proactively with your key suppliers. Although that sounds pretty straightforward, but it's to set up regular series of engagements with the business critical suppliers. It is to make contact with the additional alternative supply sources, and I think also from a sustainability perspective that there's a large risk component there, because a lot of organizations were looking for new suppliers and actually moved on to onboarding those suppliers, often without doing the proper risk and risk checks. So I think that's a good topic to talk about a little later as well. So some of the initial insights from the organizations that have progressed and are now focusing on the immediate medium term is that they have established a new normal in how they work and how to manage operations, so to avoid future workforce disruptions, for example. And I think there's a lot of learnings already coming out of China retail, that have moved into a stage of recovery where they talk a lot about safety back into the stores, and also safety from an e-commerce perspective. So we see a lot of uptick from automation and bots that actually replace non-essential manual tasks. So that could be in a store, but that could also be in a warehouse, but that could also be from a delivery perspective, where we see the uptick, for example, of safe proof of delivery, where there's no sign on glass, but where there's technology that actually makes that happen. Also freight consolidation. I think, sometimes in crisis you see innovation and freight consolidation that's now happening at an industry level, where competitors are aligned to share critical resources. Also with more workforce enabled remotely using 5G and augmented reality, we see a lot of new capability, where in life sciences, for example, there is in Korea now where basically doctors in education are being at home, and where a surgery is being shown using virtual augmented reality. Amazing, really. Next slide, please. So many organizations will use the lessons learned from COVID to build resilience within their supply chain networks. They will use analytics, data insights to restructure the supply chain flows and network design for factors that they could have anticipated. Excessive reliance on global supply chains for raw materials, key components to finished goods, but also the consequential impact of any disruption to these supply chains, for example, critical PPE components, service parts for key industries as health, life sciences, mining and defense, has actually seen a strong movement to economic nationalism and the adoption of the concept of micro supply chains. So from an operations strategy perspective, micro supply chains are best characterized as a make, or in some countries more an assemble, where you sell, and buy where you make. And I think recent geopolitical events, in addition to COVID-19, such as Brexit and the still unfolding US-China trade challenges, are accelerating the way that supply chains are restructured, with more focus on leveraging local production capability to enable flexible and agile and sustainable supply chains. As I personally tend to repeat quite frequently, the trade-off drivers of supply chain management will always remain the same, i.e. customer service levels, logistics cost, working capital and risk. However, these drivers will not change, but the relative weighting of them in key decision making will. So this means that risk mitigation will play a more dominant role over cost and working capital. And one of my professors, a renowned supply chain strategist, Martin Christopher, once said, it's therefore also no longer companies that compete, but the supply chains within they operate. So what are these competencies required to compete? as an end-to-end supply chain. So I think regardless of industry, channel, maturity or size, the competencies that are critical to tearing down and rebuilding the supply chain operating model are leveraging artificial intelligence, big data, to establish a robust supply chain resilience, to also think about, and I think this is often underestimated, but to incorporate the tax optimization into the footprint analysis. So there's greater barriers to cross-border trade, increased tariffs, export controls, and trade sanctions, to really define what these micro supply chains are and applying through segmentation. And I will talk about that in a bit more detail later. And I think one of the key elements is also to understand and embed cost to serve when you do these type of exercises. And last but not least is to also think about the inventory model, where to hold the inventory, in what format to hold the inventory, and who holds that inventory on your behalf. In line with what I will talk about a little bit later about the future of supply chains thought leadership, I would actually like to reiterate these capabilities and that supply chain leaders already embracing them in order to future-proof their supply chain. So I'll talk about that, as I said, in a little bit later. Next slide, please. Don't want to spend too much time on this slide, but the interesting part is we did a business criticality index survey around 18 months ago, and 1/3 of the respondents stated that they didn't have enough available time to analyze the source of the disruption. Therefore, are highly likely that the events will be repeated and similar impacts will be felt. And I think that in today's environment, after the crisis that we've just had, that is inexcusable. So, and I think also that there is therefore more capability available right now to respond to what we've just seen. There is tools available, there's data analytics available, but there's also what we now call predictive supply chain management that a lot of organizations are looking into. And what I'm saying with predictive supply chain management is not to say that somebody could have predicted that this virus was coming. However, the capability is there now to pick up through social media, to news outlets, whatever, to actually understand that something is happening and that it is going to be exponentially growing, and therefore that people need to activate their business continuity plans in order to fight that capability. Next slide, please. This is a typical consultant slide. If we can't convince you, we try to confuse you. So if either of the two is working, I've done a good job. But this is a capability that's being brought to market of late, and as I said, it's used in healthcare, it's used in life sciences, it's used in mining and natural resources type companies for different types of reasons, predictive maintenance. But what predictive supply chain management actually does, it's taking internal ERP data, it's taking external feeds, whether that's weather, whether that is geopolitical, whether that's biohazard, takes that information to actually make predictions and say, hey, based on what we think is going to happen, there might be a flood in Thailand, there might be a coup in also Thailand, there might be severe weather in Europe, etc. What's that doing to my supply chain from a manufacturing perspective, from an inbound inventory perspective, and what do I need to do in order to make sure that the impacts are mitigated? And I think these tools now, with great dashboard capability, with predictive but also cognitive capability, is actually the way to go in the future. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. And with regards to business stresses, I think they already existed well and truly before COVID-19. Businesses were already struggling with some of the following challenges, and I will not go through all of them, but we've just discussed the growth across e-commerce, for example, and we see in China, Asia, and Australia that demographics who previously did not shop online now do shop online and have stated that they will remain shopping online after the experience that they've had. So this is changing the channels and also the flows that go through those channels. This then also has an impact on the cost to serve and on SKU profitability. And we only have to listen to the largest retailer in the Southern Hemisphere. They've said that, you know, through this period, they've seen their revenues grow. However, their profits haven't grown or are even down, as the extra cost to fulfill the demand literally outstripped the extra revenue. So it's clear that each of these challenges would have been aggravated due to COVID-19. Next slide, please. And again, I will not spend too much time, and I actually will make these slides available to everyone after the session. So I'm more than happy to also share these type of slides. But KPMG has produced a heat map of key industries and the expected impact from COVID-19, and it's clear that industries like life sciences, defense, and health human services will fare well out of this period, but that retail, automotive, and even real estate may face a much tougher time. So, yeah, without spending too much time on it, I think this is a good overview of where the challenges are in the market, and they may not be the same challenges across the industries, but it's just a good get a good overview of where the struggles potentially are. Thank you. I think I don't want to talk through this slide, but basically, before COVID-19, I think we've already come to the realization that that organizations are at an inflection point. It is now where organizations that are still having manual processes need to start looking into digital capability. And I think people have been resting, have been waiting and say, okay, you know what, we can wait. But in many industries, if you don't move, your supplier and or your customer already has. So whether you cannot move or have decided not to move, you actually do need to make changes because the rest of your supply chain and your value chain is making those changes. So next slide, please. So in the future, supply chains, again, won't be driven by products and processes, but by customer needs. They won't depend on capital-intensive fixed assets and linear flows, but on a more ecosystem of modular capabilities, delivered often through a network of trusted third parties that can be scaled and recombined as needed. And operators will become managers, and new skills will be required, new jobs will be created. And I think tomorrow's supply chain will be much more autonomous and self-optimizing. So at a fundamental level, the way we think about supply chains is changing, and this has dramatic implications for the future. Yesterday's supply chains assumed an inside-out operating model. So supply chain management was more about focusing on business existing capabilities, on increasing operational efficiency and competing by reducing cost. And in contrast, today, and I say today and tomorrow's supply chain will be characterized by an outside-in approach, so continuously adapting and evolving to meet changing customer demand. Again, tomorrow's successful business will invest in recruiting top talent, reskilling their workforces, and partnering with knowledge providers. They'll outsource skills and capabilities in which they don't excel and sell their strongest competencies and surplus capabilities and capacities as a service. So if yesterday's supply chains were rigid and reactive, I think tomorrow's supply chains will be much more nimble and predictive. And in order for supply chains to be more nimble, agile, predictive, they need to adopt and leverage the following technologies: AI, machine learning, improved visibility and therefore visualization. I think cybersecurity, incredibly important. If we just have to listen to the Australian Prime Minister last week, that we're under cyber attacks, that one of the largest logistics organization in Australia has had its third cyber attack with significant impact on its operations. So I think all of these capabilities and going into blockchain, cloud technology are extremely important in order to be at the forefront of what supply chain management is about. Next one, please. I'll skip that one. Next one, please. So this is my last slide, so don't worry. And I'll actually take a Chinese approach. I'll go from the right, because I think supply chains is where it starts. Customer-centric supply chains is where it starts. And I think as good logisticians, I don't know how many logisticians we have on the call, but we're all slightly cynical at times. And being customer-centric was something we already read about in the textbooks of the 1980s. And maybe even before, nothing new there. Therefore, again, I will say that the key principles of supply chain management are finding the trade-off between customer service, logistics cost, working capital, and risk. That will always remain the same. However, what is significantly different is the cloud-based technology, the power of advanced data analytics, and the ability to do customer segmentation to the individual, and to also understand cost to serve to the most detailed customer segment. So these capabilities allow us to find multiple points of supply chain optimization compared to the decades-old one-size-fits-all solution. So again, tomorrow's supply chain and successful businesses will use information from IoT devices, third-party sources to anticipate customer needs, often and before the customer themselves are even aware of it. Moreover, they'll be able to segment their customer by different patterns of behavior, targeting marketing efforts and developing purpose-built supply chains to actually service each segment more effectively. But what goes hand in hand, and I think I'll reiterate that one more time, it's great to be customer-centric. It's great to be to segment to the lowest level, but one needs to understand the cost to serve for each of those segments, so that you can actually, and that you know, and that you agree to this cost before you actually serve these customers. Now, moving over, it's not only customers enjoying unprecedented levels of choice and convenience as a result of the emerging technologies. I think the rise of digital platforms has also opened supply chains up to the world of new opportunities. Even the elements of the supply chain itself, from planning through manufacturing and inventory to fulfillment, can now be purchased as a service from third-party providers and managed through platforms. But also, platforms enable manufacturers and logistics companies to become as a service provider themselves. So creating new revenue streams by monetizing surplus capacity, and successful companies are increasingly turning to platforms to drive growth. Tomorrow's supply chain, and I hear that I use that word a lot, but tomorrow's supply chains will also be very intelligent, predictive, and self-correcting. They will collect data from sensors, from cameras, from applications, using advanced machine learning algorithms to monitor, but also to adjust automatically detected discrepancy between designed and actual performance. And I think an exponential increase in the volume of available data is already putting pressure on these market-leading organizations to recruit specialist analysts capable of turning that data into insights, which will cut costs, diversify products, and drive sales. But at the same time, it's not just supply chain people that are looking after these or looking for these people. It's the entire organization that is looking for these people. So having a strategy to find the right people and to manage these people and keep them interested is going to be very important. I think we talked about modeling the voice of the customer and having a deep understanding of customer buying behaviors, but I think also in order to predict changes in the wider market more accurately, tomorrow's successful organizations will also leverage data from sources outside of the enterprise. I talked about that. Above all, they develop better data governance capabilities, collecting, integrating, and leveraging data to create a clearer, more granular picture of customer demand. And when we talk about customer demand, what I've heard over the past couple of months or weeks is that, yeah, our demand is changing. We have more demand, less demand, but people don't actually understand the demand profile. And I think that is so important for organizations. With e-commerce growing, it's no longer maybe delivering pallets into a restaurant, but it's delivering boxes or layers of pallets into individual areas. And I think having that understanding is the actual impact that the future of supply chain to big data actually has. Now, I won't talk a lot about cognitive decision centers because I think a lot of people would say, again, that's just a consulting word put together. But I think what these cognitive decision centers are actually bringing, it's a control tower on steroids, and it's actually giving you an enterprise-wide visibility of the organization, and it's allowing you to do what-if scenarios across the end-to-end organization. Whereas control towers were very much supply chain focused, were very much silo focused. The decision towers are actually enterprise-wide, and you can actually make decisions that were meant to be enterprise-wide decisions, and that was actually what the role of supply chain ought to be many years ago. Now, last but not least, before I hand over to Christian, it's the concept of micro supply chains, and I think that's again something that will resonate with many organizations in the new normal, the new world, and it's one of the lessons learned from COVID-19 is that the need and a desire to have local manufacturing, or at least local final assembly, in order to make our supply chains more resilient. So one of the learnings from our work at a large global consumer health organization in China is that for seasonal and promo products, they're either often overproduced, resulting in markdowns or write-offs, or underproduced and underallocated, resulting in lost sales and potential lost market share. So with the capability of local, regional manufacturing of smaller batches for popular promo packs and seasonal products, one could actually leverage the large batch, low-cost country manufacturing for the base demand and the small batch local manufacturing for the demand-driven top-ups. And in addition, applying product postponement, and we're not talking about something really new. Postponement, I think, has been around since Adam was a boy, but at least since 1980. So applying product postponement in the local markets could be another opportunity, whether that is with regards to client-specific artwork, promotional bundling, and packaging. So these activities have often been seen as a problem or a challenge. However, ones as an opportunity could actually become an enhanced revenue stream. This is how far I would like to talk. So I've been talking about what are the key lessons learned from an immediate perspective, what are the medium to longer term elements that an organization needs to think about, talking about predictive supply chain management, and then at the end talk about the 6 capabilities that have been highlighted as the capabilities that a supply chain of the future ought to have. So with that, I would like to hand back to Antonio and to Christian, and like to thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Henry. Just a reminder, we are getting some questions coming through, so please, if you do think of a question, type it in the box. We will address the questions. We don't want you to forget what they are, and then we will be asking during the Q&A to raise your hand and interact with our presenters. Next up is Christian, and I'm going to hand over to Christian now. Christian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Antonio. But first of all, really a very good late afternoon to Australia from good old Europe. I almost said Germany, and in fact where I'm at the moment. Henry, thank you very much for your great input, and I have to say I'm a bit jealous about the slides that you showed. I can see we will be able to improve. Well, with this, having started, just a few words about myself in the context of where I am coming from, starting out in the manufacturing sector, actually running 3 different types of factories in Sri Lanka: technical textiles, the latex industry, and mold making, injection molding, and assembly. This was really a good in-depth insight in the reality on the ground of a developing country. I had a brief stay with BMW thereafter, before joining the toy industry, and some 16 years ago, I actually set up an organization called the ICTI Care Foundation with offices in New York and Hong Kong, today even expanded to Shenzhen, really tackling sustainability in the toy industry. And it was then after 10 years that I accepted in 2014 the opportunity to head, well, back then, the Foreign Trade Association and what you know as amfori today. I've had the privilege to visit Australia multiple times, but in February this year, before, let's say, in a certain way, the COVID hell broke through, I had the opportunity to spend actually quite some time getting more insight into your country, the people, and how things are done. I made some great stakeholders, including from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment, the EU delegation in Australia and Canberra, the Australian Border Force, the Australian Human Rights Commission, and your very MP or Member of Parliament, Jason Wood. I also had the chance to speak with a number of stakeholders in Australia's supply chain, outside of our members, including the New South Wales farmers, the National Farmers Federation, Australian Pork Association, but also really interesting, the sustainable wine growing of Australia. During my visit, I got the opportunity to actually visit a Black Angus cattle farm just outside of Goulburn. And the farm had also several windmills across the property as part of the Crookwell wind farm. And it was a blend of the new and the old worlds. And that is what I found most fascinating in Australia, to be this blend of worlds. Looking at amfori, we typically define countries either by members or by producers. Australia in this context is unique, being a hybrid of the two. It has immense sort of agricultural, fishery, mining, and service sectors that supply not only the local market, but very much international economies. At the same time, it trades on the global market, importing products from all around the world, and that is Asia, the Middle East, Europe, the United States, South America, or even the African continent. So in terms of supply chains, Australia is uniquely placed, and COVID-19 has impacted everywhere and everyone, and it is reshaping our future. And today I will try to examine a bit the impact of what we have seen on supply chain sustainability. What is sustainability? Amfori takes a holistic view of sustainability. Traditionally, sustainability was defined primarily from an environmental perspective, looking at water and energy usage or reduction of waste outputs via recycling or better processes. Life cycle analysis led to circular economies. But we at amfori believe that sustainability also needs to very much include human rights, prosperity, and fair and open trade. Amfori itself is the leading non-profit business association of global commerce that enables organizations to enhance human prosperity, the use of natural resources responsibly, and very importantly, to drive open global trade. And we call this trade with purpose. Amfori's impact on the trade sector dates to our origins more than 40 years ago, actually the year 1977. Although we are a Brussels-based organization with a strong connection, obviously, to the European Union, sustainable trade is something that we encourage globally. Our 2,400 members greatly benefit from sharing information and thereby having better leverage vis-a-vis producers, and at the same time reduce audit fatigue by sharing information. Last year alone, our members in this context were able to save about $94 million in doing so by avoiding multiple monitoring activities. amfori also contributes to the sustainability chapters of EU free trade agreements, and let's say I'm very pleased that the most recent one, the EU-Vietnam FTA, has finally gone live, so to say, and this is indeed very encouraging. But at the same time, what I would like to mention, that coming from the trip to Australia and meetings with, let's say, relevant stakeholders, it is very clear European Union and Australia clearly see eye to eye at this point. In fact, the introduction of the Australia Modern Slavery Act challenges the European Union a little bit in how it chooses to trade with purpose. However, in this context, the topic of even mandatory human rights due diligence is pretty high on the agenda at the Commission. And with Germany assuming the presidency of the EU Council just in a week's time, we'll see even more momentum here. How do we measure impact if we don't first measure sustainability? And amfori, we monitor and measure sustainability through two separate platforms, initiatives. These are on one side the Business Environmental Performance Initiative, known as amfori BSCI, and the Business Social Compliance Initiative, known as amfori BSCI. Both are based on our approach of continuous improvement. amfori BSCI, as the name implies, is an environmental assessment platform that addresses business challenges in their direct operations and across their supply chains. And I'm pleased to say that Australia has the highest BSCI activity of our membership by country and continent. Really very encouraging. On the amfori BSCI side, this is an auditing platform that our members use to monitor their supply chains and specifically improve their social performance. It empowers our members to live up to our slogan of trade with purpose. Both platforms allow transparency and accountability of our members' supply chains. In fact, we just launched our new integrated sustainability platform only last week, combining both initiatives on one platform for better transparency and maybe even more importantly, higher efficiency for our members. Something I understand that Henry mentioned is going to be a key aspect, whether it is the data that you gather in-house or you look beyond, and I just learned a new term here with data laking, not to be misled by leaking. It provides a single point for supply chain performance information. And as far as I know, it is the only platform currently on the market that will actually allow multi-tier supply chain transparency. Very often we have seen that you only have transparency about the manufacturing situation when it comes to tier number one. Let's have a quick look at amfori BSCI. For those that are not really familiar with amfori's terminology, our members, for retailers and suppliers, we refer to their supply chains, the factories, the farmers, as producers. amfori BSCI really covers a comprehensive scope of 11 environmental performance areas ranging from energy use, greenhouse gases to chemical management or biodiversity. And importantly, BSCI now includes the timber due diligence program to assist our members to understand their evolving legislation on wood products certification to gain visibility of their timber supply chain and assess and mitigate potential risk. On the next slide, we can see, let's have a quick look at the data that we have found around amfori BSCI. It is, as BSCI only started significantly later, we really properly kicked it off 5 years ago. It's substantially smaller than the BSCI platform, but I think I find it very encouraging to see the growth that we have seen. And in fact, we see a 42% increase in producers coming onto the platform. Interestingly, this increase continued to occur even during COVID-19 pandemic that we have seen so far. When we look at the next slide, although it is kind of a bit difficult to say what prompted the continued growth of COVID-19 months, we can correlate this also with an increase in producer activity to an increase in our member activity. Henry also talked about resilience. We can very much see this here. Basically, we can see that members coming onto our platform spiked during the peak months of the COVID-19 crisis after remaining stagnant for pretty much 18 months period. So taking this into account, we may think that the threat of an pandemic like COVID to the environmental sustainability is being mitigated by members engaging their supply chains on our platform. However, and I think I need to mention this also, the numbers of amfori BPI audits conducted differ between equivalent months in 2019 and 2020, as obviously sites visits literally come to a stop due to COVID-19. January saw a 53% drop in assessments, while May only recorded 19. Well, what does it mean in terms of supply chain sustainability caused by COVID-19? In terms of the environmental sustainability, the risks are not that great. Firstly, there have been significant improvements in environmental legislation in many producing countries, clamping down really on illegal activities and poor standards. One can only hope that maybe also the South American continent is learning this at some point. But secondly, one of the impacts of COVID-19 was really a complete shutdown, a significant limitation on capacity of production sites. If a site isn't producing or producing less, they're also less likely to have an environmental negative impact. Let's now have a brief look at amfori BSCI. This platform monitors social performance in global supply chains. Supply chains have become increasingly complex, and what we heard from Henry, it might even add an additional dimension if you have an element of onshoring happening in the future. The system itself is based on the ILO core conventions, and as far as I know, we were the first initiative to fully integrate the guiding principles of business and human rights, as well as the OECD guidelines. BSCI is itself based on 13 performance areas, including social management system, working hours, fair remuneration, no child labor, no bonded labor, or ethical business behaviors. I think all very straightforward and common practice. The platform enables producers to take an active role through training opportunities and what I mentioned, the continuous improvement aspect of their practices. And in this context, it doesn't really matter whether you join as a pretty good one or as one that has significant room for improvement. You can always find the next level. Looking at sourcing countries, we examined the top sourcing countries of our members in 2019. And we can see that China is by far overwhelmingly the major sourcing country. I think you can see that very well on the slide. And even when we look at the development, the most recent development, its role has become even more prominent in 2020. So as such, we can clearly see a dominance here, but we can also see that other sourcing countries as India have, for example, dropped 2 places to the 5th place. Bangladesh certainly has experienced a well-documented fall due to COVID-19 with a rapid crash in what I would call the ready-made garment sector and the country's largest export product, of course, and being the most significant employer of the industry. Well, just talking about this in terms of Bangladesh, I mean, they lost about 6 billion in revenue due to canceled orders in a sector that on an annual basis is valued at 34 billion. So it really is a very significant impact here. COVID-19 has and continues to be a major disruptor for global supply chains. No question about this. Looking at the dominance of the Chinese supply chain, we have seen strong resilience in the monitoring activities there as well, different to the Indian subcontinent, whether it is Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, where activities have basically come to a standstill. While talking about monitoring activities, I just wanted to briefly share this slide with you where you can see the comparison over a 3-year period. You can see we had an excellent start in the first 3 weeks in January of this year. Well, and then COVID-19 hit, and you can see the impact itself. At the same time, I would like you to pay attention that by the time we moved to the end of March of this year, China sort of came back, and while we are certainly year on year well behind our monitoring activities, there is absolutely a reason to be sort of optimistic going forward that we can catch up. You can see this also on the next slide when we just compare the cumulative impact just on a global scale and then compare it with China. I think it is pretty straightforward, not just for, let's say, amfori, but you can see clearly the dependence, the global dependence on China as a powerhouse and as the factory of this world. Well, when I say that China appears to be demonstrating a strong resilience with the audit volume recovering, is there a problem? I would say to some extent, yes. You know, this is where the holistic view of sustainability is being challenged. Unlike environmental sustainability, which is more easily identifiable, the human risk within supply chains are significantly amplified by a pandemic such as COVID-19. And maybe just to refer to a recent ILO report of which amfori has a partnership with, states that the current crisis, like those before, pose serious risk to the increase in child labor. According to their study, it's a 1% rise in poverty leads to a 0.7 increase in child labor instances. The informal economy, as businesses contract and credit issues arise, lead households to use all available family members to generate the much needed income. And I believe I can maybe shortly refer to India here and the dramatic impact that we have seen. This is also when I look at, some of you might have heard the ideas of the Indian government to relax even some labor laws like working 12 hours a day and not even pay any overtime compensation. And in this context, I would like to mention that together with other like-minded organizations, we have written 2 weeks ago to the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, sorry to say, condemning such considerations. On the positive side here, really, Australia has a National Modern Slavery Act, and the decrease in transparency along with the financial impact of the pandemic increases the risk of child labor within an organization's supply chain. This can have lasting negative implications for a brand reputation and consumer trust. So I'm very, very encouraged that you have this in place, and I just hope it's going to be used to the maximum. Let's now have a quick look at feedback that we received from our members on external factors. COVID-19 was certainly an ever-evolving situation for everyone, including amfori, and we established a COVID-19 task force to investigate how we could better serve our membership and their producers and help them through this crisis. And in this context, we used a survey. We delved deeper into what the main external impacts were for our members as well as their producers. And the questions to respondents were given their chances of choosing 3. The top external factors you can see here, and just very briefly, decreasing demand by consumers, obviously the biggest concern of our members. And that led to cancellation or delays of orders. Production suspension in sourcing countries. You remember initially the lockdown in China, and then when we wanted to restart, not sufficient capacities being available. Blocked or delayed shipments due to logistic suspensions. And then when you arrive at your destination, you had delays of shipments due to customs, or border controls. And we can see that the impact of COVID was across the entire supply chain, from the producer to the consumer and vice versa. Looking at the producer feedback, not a surprise, cancellation of sales orders by buyers was by far the biggest concern. Others were a reduction in the quantity of sales orders by buyers, and then very similar as we have seen from our member side, the customs, border controls, or logistic challenges. So immediately we began to see that COVID-19 had externally affected both members and producers in a comparable way. So we dug then a little deeper to understand what it is that members and producers need in terms of support to overcome, let's say, some impact of the pandemic. Our members, with a large majority, said that they wanted government incentive support measures to help with the recovery. Sustainable sourcing strategies was kind of a distant second. And I think we have seen this across the world. I mean, Australia, as much as Europe, the United States. I mean, I at some point thought $1 million is a lot of money, $1 billion was already crazy, but we are talking trillions of dollars being put into our global economies to kind of restart and soften the impact. Well, the producer's highest response was that buyers adopt a sustainable sourcing, a responsible purchasing practice to maintain trade, to maintain a business reality. So let's think about sustainability as a big picture. I started this presentation by saying that we define it holistically to go beyond the environmental criteria. The producers are asking for sustainable trade from members to improve human prosperity, whilst members are asking for transparency via monitoring activities to ensure that human rights and safe working conditions are upheld. And one of the impacts of COVID-19 on sustainability is that it has allowed us to identify this information from our members and producers and work with both to move forward beyond this global crisis. When we look at the impact in response to what we were seeing, we had no choice but to show an element of flexibility. We respected the auditor's discretion to be able to audit sites either due to risk or citing being on lockdown. Although this was not an ideal scenario from a sustainability perspective, it was and remains a reality we all have to work. We all had to work with. As already mentioned, for example, the situation in the Indian subcontinent will mean that we will extend this approach in areas where monitoring activities simply cannot take place. But this is really only the last resort. Having said this, the pandemic certainly, had an impact on amfori as well. When the audit process is disturbed and the supply chain transparency shifts towards kind of a more translucent situation, we as an organization have to respond to these challenges in two ways. The first was the development of a resilience action plan. We saw a drop in revenue, increase in our bad debt provision, really coming from the member side, but also our audit upload fees. So we had no choice but to cut deep into our OPEX expenditure to be cash positive at the end of 2020. This was to some extent painful, but I believe absolutely necessary in order to be able to continue to serve our members as they rightly expect. The second was that we needed to look at the purchasing behavior of our members. And in early April, we released a guide, responsible purchasing practices in times of COVID-19. Although these are challenging times for all of us, amfori asked its members to continue due diligence, responsible business conduct, and to carry out responsible purchasing practices. And I would indeed very much like you to actually go to our website and take a look at this document. Having said this, we also expect our members and their business partners to take this rather seriously. And we are in the process of developing what we call a responsible purchasing practices global grievance mechanism. And this grievance mechanism, to put it a bit into context, is the development around increasing transparency about the behavior. We are certainly not a perfect organization. And if you can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. You know, we want to actively take steps raising the questions towards this path. What can we do as an organization to improve responsibility throughout their supply chains? And the grievance mechanism is an offer, a channel for the producers to come forward with a grievance to amfori, where in turn we then seek our member to engage with our producer. It is much about the element of dialogue and collaboration to take place. And while we are not resolving any dispute or a grievance in this context, we strongly encourage both sides to really proactively engage and find a solution for issues they have on hand. And that's primarily, I mean, not to cancel order, maybe delay something, continue to make payments, do not impose unilateral new payment terms, etc. So in conclusion, the pandemic is unprecedented in the impact that it has had globally. No question about this. Supply chains have been affected across each tier, across every sector, and across every industry. The consumer has been impacted financially, which has impacted demand, as we can see across the world. Producers have experienced closures and cutbacks that affect the availability of goods and certainly the offer for jobs. Countries like Bangladesh have had extreme damage done to their one single key industry, and this increases the risk of child labor, forced labor, and on top, precarious employment conditions. These modern slavery conditions are a concern for us all. At least I hope so. The amfori BSCI monitoring process addresses these risks by increasing transparency, identifying areas of concern, hotspots issues, and addresses them through effective remediation process in collaboration with members. A strong element here is our amfori Academy. So sustainability is no longer only about the environment. Everyone, that is the consumers, members, producers, and stakeholders, want us to see sustainable supply chains. Producers list this as the top priority. Members recognize it as a top priority as well. But to achieve this, we need dialogue and communication, as I already said in the context of the grievance mechanism. That is, we need our members to communicate with their producers and the producers to communicate on challenges with their buyers. Understanding the issues, working together is what achieves sustainability. We were able to do it for the environmental factors. Producers know the expectation in these regards. Governments enforced environmental regulations, incentivized businesses make changes. COVID has had a devastating global impact, but from this, it is also an opportunity to reshape trade to become more sustainable, more transparent, with greater human benefits. I leave it at this for the moment, and later on look forward to any questions. Thank you for your attention and joining.
Thank you, Christian. So now we're going to go into the question and answer part of our webinar today. Would anyone like to raise their hand, or shall I just read out the questions that we have so far? Okay, so we do have a question here for Henry. Henry, thank you. Sasha liked your outlining on supply chain risk management. Would you be able to go into the complexity of this and its effects during this time in the overview slide a bit more? So can we pull up that slide, please? It was supply chain risk management with Henry's presentation. Sorry, Naomi.
Could you repeat the question one more time?
Yes. I like your outlining on supply chain risk management. Would you be able to go into the complexity of this, of stress and its effects during this time a bit more?
Henry,
can you advise which slide it is, please?
I think it's 4, I guess. I think it's slide 4.
Stress scale. Sorry, it's the stress scale.
Ah, okay.
Thank you.
The answer is probably not. I think with regards,
the complexity of this during this current time.
yeah. So again, I think this is just a picture that was put up based on the different conversations that we've had with people in the industries, and where we've heard and felt that that some of these industries are moving towards. So if I would think retail, yeah, retail has been hit extremely hard. It was already in Australia, and I think globally, one of the sectors that is already struggling with its identity, I would almost say. When I talk about retail, I'm not necessarily talking about food and beverage and grocery retail, probably talking more about specialty retail, fashion retail, etc. So what we see happening there is a complete shift of operating model, much more e-commerce online type of activity, but then from a, let's call it a middle and back office support from a supply chain, but also from other support organizations, not yet really aligned of how that new customer proposition needs to be supported. So I think that's where retail is struggling at the moment. If I take a more positive outlook and I look at life sciences and I look at pharma, for example, life sciences from a medical device had a bit of a standstill because of the elective surgeries, but now again there is clarity on what type of surgeries are allowed again, and they've actually had a bit of and this is for the football supporters and for the Dutchies online. Our famous Johan Cruyff always used to say, every disadvantage has an advantage. So what life sciences did, it almost took the time off when the surgeries were off, and really been using that time to redistributing inventory across the different hospitals from a consignment stock perspective. They looked at their loan kits and they basically started redistributing material, and they basically have used the data and the insights that they've had over time, but where they really didn't have the opportunity to correct, they've actually used this time to rebalance the inventory across their customer base. So I think that's all I can say from a stress scale perspective. If there's any specific questions, I'll take them on notice. I'll take them away, and we'll come back with a more structured answer if that's okay.
Actually, Henry, whilst we're on this slide, we have another question, and Sasha says thanks for answering that. With regard to the automotive industry, based on this slide, so the automotive manufacturing has moved away from Australia. This will not return. Correct. KPMG has it as an industry in red. Where is it heading?
Good question. So I think from an industry where it's heading, let me take that on notice. What I think is changing in that industry is that it becomes absolutely more of a sales and distribution type organization with manufacturing, of course, offshore, and that takes completely different capabilities. So again, all these organizations will need to think about their operating model and say, okay, how do we become actually better at supply chain and supply chain management? How do we get better at procurement? How do we get better at inventory and freight management? And I think the actual automotive industries, it's looking at what the dealers are doing, and the dealers become retail outlets and become very closely aligned to customers, and therefore understanding what the customer requirements are. What is it that when you go to a automotive outlet, let's say you go to your Toyota garage, what is it, the service that you expect? And that this now needs to be translated in saying, okay, that's the front office. How does the middle and the back office from a supply chain perspective need to respond, either with parts availability, visibility of where these parts are, the track and trace along the way, so that you as a consumer only have to go there once. You don't have to come back for the fact that one part was missing, etc. So I think the automotive industry is much more moving towards a customer experience type of sector, where the upstream manufacturing becomes more of a sales and a distribution capability.
Henry, while we're still on this slide, we do have another
Lord.
question.
This slide was only there to give some inputs, but here we go. Maybe it's the color that's attracting people.
Henry, why is the aerospace in green as a stress sector when airlines have come to an almost total halt during COVID-19?
Because I don't think aerospace is linked to aerospace and defense, so it's more around the rockets and the things like that. But that's the question that I'll take on notice, because everything I'll say more, I will not do justice to that comment.
Okay. Henry,
that's the
we
last
have another
question I answer about that slide.
Okay. Henry, can you elaborate more on the micro supply chain and give a concrete example?
Yes. So there's a few concrete examples. One is Adidas, or Christian will probably pronounce it correctly in German, where they've really segregated their supply chains and have made a what they call a customer-focused supply chain. So where you go as an individual and you get your feet tested, and they basically make the shoes based on your size of your feet, the width of your feet, any issues that you have with your feet from a sizing and from a form and shape perspective, and they're able to actually turn that around in 3 to 4 days. So they've seen the fact that from a customer experience and from a personalization perspective, that's something that is really key to them. So that's an example. But the example that I actually brought forward is an example out of consumer health, where there's a lot of promotional packs being built. So let's say a customer is a Walmart, and a Walmart says, hey, I will use product A and product B, but I want it bundled, and you give me product C. Or where there's specific artwork, so labeling or anything to do that makes it specific for that client. From a promotional perspective, from a seasonality perspective, the demand forecasting is relatively difficult. So you try to keep the goods in a generic format as long as possible. You might make batches on a base demand, but that you're able to flex when there's a spike in demand, either through value-added services, which can be done by a third-party logistics provider or something like that. So it's having that ability to postpone and to wait for the finalization of the product till the last possible moment. And I always use an example that maybe be around since 1980 or something like that, and it's about paint. One thing that people that are old enough to know that paint used to be in the stores and only in limited colors, but if you go to a store right now, if you go to Bunnings or you go to any other DIY store, they hold the core collars in stock, and they can actually on demand make you a 1 liter, 5 liter, 10 liter of any color that you want. For me, that is postponement. For me, that is micro supply chain. So micro supply chains is actually either do a local production, but also local assembly, and postpone that conversion to the latest possible time.
Thanks, Henry. Christian, we have a question for you as well. How does amfori contribute to increasing transparency levels in supply chains again after we've lost some due to COVID-19?
I would like to, first of all, thank you very much for the question. A really very important topic. At amfori, we, for example, launched a strategic project, even approved by, let's say, our multi-stakeholder involvement that we have with our stakeholder advisory council and our member advisory council in December 2018. And this is about transparency. But I think it's not just the transparency alone. This is coupled very closely to a project we call impact assessment. And we absolutely want to learn better. And forgive me, Henry, we had a project here with Deloitte on a pilot. Where
everybody makes mistakes, Christian.
Yeah, one makes mistakes once in a while. Yeah, to really measure the impact of our actions through the programs that we actually deploy. And what is important for us is then to also be open in the context of sharing this information. When we look at transparency, we see it actually on 3 levels. The first one is in fact amfori, and we are just embarking on this journey. I mentioned that we launched our new platform, and the new platform will really enable us a very different level of dashboard, sort of feed into dashboards. So that is to basically report, this is what we come across, this is what we see in terms of trends, maybe in a particular sector. We cover a wide range of industry sectors, 21 at the moment, from food and non-food, from textiles to porcelain to fish, etc. So we want to report about what we find on an accumulated organization and wide level. We will then go down to the member level. This is, where we are considering, we're not finished with the project, where we're considering to offer different levels of transparency on the members, where they source, maybe monitoring results, monitoring outcomes and development thereof. So it will be an option for our members to choose which level of transparency to demonstrate and show. And last but not least, also the producer, the farm, going down to farm level, where we would give the opportunity then to a particular producer to show, let's say, their performance. And again, this coupled then with impact assessment and to see what are the areas that are particularly helpful in making sustainable change, or to identify areas, okay, there we really need to resharpen the tools in order to be more impactful, I believe is crucially important in this context. I hope that helps a bit.
Thanks, Christian. Thank you to everyone for your questions. We will address the rest of these questions, and to answer one of the requests, you will be receiving a link which will have the presentations. I'd now like to invite Jasper to wrap up and share his final thoughts on today's presentations. Just a quick thank you to both speakers on my behalf. Jasper, are you ready? I'm ready to hand over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Antonio. And I would like to thank Christian and Henry on behalf of all the participants and the NCCA for sharing your insights on the impact of COVID-19 on global supply chains from probably a business angle on the one hand, and looking at social compliance and environmental performance of stakeholders in supply chains on the other. It's a very, very relevant topic, very current, very interesting, and has many touch points with the business community and wider society overall, really. We really appreciate it. So thank you very much, Christian and Henry, again. Probably two key things that I took away from the presentations at a very high level were that the impact of COVID-19 on global supply chains has been significant in Henry's presentation, and it has certainly exposed significant or brought forward business risks and trends, but also amplified consumer behavior, leading to different consumption patterns, which means that business leaders are faced with a storm of change, but also opportunity on demand and supply sides. The other thing that I took away from Henry's presentation is that now more than ever, technology applications and the ability to manage, process, and integrate significant data sets and turn them into insights, more importantly, are important to those businesses that want to survive and thrive in a modern supply chain. Another thing that I took away was that nimble, agile, and predictive supply chains will be the future. So that was a key thing for me. On the amfori side, I've really learned that this sustainability and supply chains has been impacted by COVID-19, mostly at a transparency and monitoring level, if you like, and also business focus levels, because business has obviously taken their focus away from kind of a little bit of compliance for a little while, especially when it first hit. Stakeholders, however, in the supply chain are resilient and continue to value sustainability as an important factor. And amfori will play an integral role in working together with members, producers, and wider stakeholders to promote collaboration to ensure this topic stays high on the agenda. I think that's probably two or three things that I took away. Very insightful. As mentioned at the start of the webinar, we will take away any questions that may have not been answered in the session, and we'll try and answer these via email to all participants. In a final note, in closing, on behalf of the Netherlands Chamber of Commerce Australia, amfori, and KPMG, thanks to all participants in this informative, truly global webinar. I think there's been, I don't know how many countries were represented, but there were a few. And look forward to being in touch on one way or the other. Have a great morning, afternoon, or evening from wherever you're dialing in. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasper.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.